Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Exercise is Bullshit. I'm your host, Logan McGurley, joined today by the distinguished Dr. Brad Schoenfeld. Brad is a professor at Lehman College, and is it Manhattan or Brooklyn? Where is it at? Where is it?
The Bronx.
The Bronx, okay, in the Bronx, in New York. So he is one of the most distinguished exercise science professors in the entire industry. And he's got a few colleagues that have been guests on the podcast already that we've talked to previously. But Brad, please introduce yourself. Say hello.
Yeah, my pleasure, Logan. I believe you've had some of my students on, but yeah, I'm a educated researcher at Lehman, professor and director of the graduate studies program, and happy to be on.
Yeah, I've had Max on, obviously, and Ryan Burke, and then Milo, who I know doesn't work for you directly, but helps, and then obviously Pat as well. So it's really exciting to see them helping you guys out with all your research. So obviously you're one of the more distinguished leaders in the field of exercise. Do you happen to know how many papers you've actually been a part of or published at this point?
I don't know exactly, but it's more than 350.
Wow, that's impressive. So what for listeners who might not be familiar with your work, what do you do in particular at Lehman, and what is your exercise science lab focus on?
Yeah, so the name of the lab is the Applied Muscle Development Lab, the AMDL. And as the name implies, my focus is on applied research for generally muscle hypertrophy, strength, and sometimes power. But hypertrophy and strength is the main focus. Done research on many other topics, including some basic research into mechanisms, sports supplement research, and some fat loss research, and other topics as well. But the majority are on applied muscle development.
Yeah, and you're kind of the hypertrophy, the muscle growth guy. I actually have a copy of your hypertrophy book on my bookshelf somewhere, but I can't see it at the moment. But I know it's there.
I trust you.
It's the textbook on growing muscle. So as we kind of transition into the topic of this episode, Brad, one of the things that we really focus on this podcast is sort of being evidence-based in the sense of how have you changed your mind over the course of your career? What things did you used to believe and maybe transition on? And that'll be sort of the big overarching theme today. But what is something in particular you can think of that you've changed your mind on? Taking a pretty drastic 180, let's say, in the last 3 to 5 years.
There's been many things I've changed my opinions on to varying degrees. I think the most stark example I can give is on loading. So it had always been taught as an up-and-coming exercise science student and professional that you needed to train relatively heavy. There was this hypertrophy range of 6 to 12 reps, but that when you got above 12, certainly 15 reps, basically you're doing glorified cardio, and that you're not going to, the rationale was you're not going to fully activate the type 2 muscle fibers, the high threshold motor units that are attached to these type 2 muscle fibers, which have the greatest hypertrophic capacity, and thus you're not going to gain any appreciable muscle. And I had bought into that, and then some colleagues of mine, I'll give you a quick story, a colleague, Stu Phillips, who you might know, a terrific researcher out of McMaster University. He had done a study circa 2012 and had posted on Facebook about the results showing that there was no difference between 80% one arm and 30% one arm. But it was in untrained subjects using just a leg extension. And my infinite wisdom at that time, I went on and said, come on, Stu, these are untrained subjects. They're just doing leg extensions. I'm going to redo the study in trained subjects with a real ecologically valid routine that's using different exercises for all the major muscle groups, and you're going to see there's not going to be enough of a stimulus to promote hypertrophy. Well, long story short, about a year later, I carried out that study, and no difference. It was really surprising to me, and there's just been so much evidence since then, so that was kind of the initiation of that transition away from the particular theory. But I mean, there's now been a mountain of data that we have that I think if there's one topic from the variables, the manipulation of variables, that I would find it hard to see any evidence that would change that view, it would be this topic, that you can achieve at least whole muscle hypertrophy across a very wide spectrum of loading ranges. Somewhere I would say between, conceivably one, but you'd have to do a lot more sets. But let's say 5 or 6 reps up to 30 plus reps. There is some evidence that when you get above into really high rep ranges, 50, 60, that there's diminishing effects. I would say that probably is because people aren't able to sustain intensity at that point. They get so bored from just keep lifting that they basically are failing way before they're giving up way before they're actually failing muscularly. Also, we'll say that I think there's still, the jury is still out if there may be a fiber type specific effect. So there may be some benefits to higher reps for type 1 fibers, and type 2 fibers may show some greater effects for heavier loads. Some evidence from our lab actually did not support that, but I think it's too early to know, and probably for those who are looking to optimize gains, doing a combination of somewhat heavier and somewhat lighter loads probably would be my general recommendation. Anyway, certainly I think for the majority of people just looking to gain muscle, which is probably the majority of people who are training, you don't have to worry about your rep range, at least up to 30 plus reps.
Yeah, and I think that really opens up the opportunities for, being flexible where you train as well, right? So if you don't have the opportunity to work in a gym, maybe you're traveling, you've only got limited dumbbells, right? You can still get a great workout and still get a similar hypertrophic effect from working with a wide variety of ranges. And I've talked to some of your colleagues and previous students that have been a part of other research that you've done that has looked at that as well. So that's great.
By the way, I want to just clarify too that it assumes that you're training relatively close to failure. Within
that's a good point.
The studies that we've had generally are to failure studies. If you're just using very light loads and you're stopping with a 10 RIR, you're not going to achieve comparable hypertrophy. So it really shows that it's the effort involved. Using a high level of effort is going to be paramount.
Yeah, I love that. And that's something we'll talk a little bit about today as well, is failure versus sort of the emerging field of kind of reps and reserve and what that looks like, and what is the actual cutoff point. But that's a great transition. And I'd love to talk about one of the, probably the biggest things in the industry right now that I'm sure you're super familiar with. And I think your university just conducted a study on this, is partials. So I'd love to keep this really high level, kind of like you did there with the repetition continuum. Tell me about what you used to believe when it came to partial range of motion repetitions. For me, it was that full range of motion was always superior, but usually that was comparing to like a shortened position, right? So bicep curl, doing the last, top third versus a full range of motion. What do you think now when I talk about partial range of motion reps, and what does the research seem to point to?
Yeah, great question. I know this is a topic that's gotten a lot of controversy in the field, but I believe similarly to you that full range was better than partial range. But again, the comparisons were specific to generally to full range versus a shortened partial. And there's been, I think, pretty compelling evidence now that lengthened partial is better than a shortened partial from a hypertrophy standpoint. Strength is a little different because there is a specificity to the angles of training, which has been shown in our group. We have a study and review that'll, I think, show that again from a strength perspective. But from a hypertrophy perspective, most of the research seems to show and suggest that there's greater hypertrophy in a lengthened versus a shortened partial. There does not seem to be much difference between a full ROM and a lengthened ROM. So just doing a lengthened partial versus a full range of motion seem to produce relatively similar benefits. Our group just came out with a study showing that there was really no difference in the hypertrophy. So what that would lead me to conclude, so again, I want to emphasize that this is still a somewhat newly investigated topic, and I think we need more. The strength of evidence exists on the continuum from weak to strong. I would not say I have strong opinions on this, but where I'm at this point is that I think the evidence suggests that the lengthened portion is the most important part of the repetition from a hypertrophy standpoint. So you don't lose anything by doing a full range of motion, and you generally will get better strength gains throughout the full range if you're looking for full ROM strength gains. But from a hypertrophy standpoint, I think it emphasizes that you should emphasize the lengthened position. I know some people, they'll be doing like shoulder presses like this. So it really is important to make sure that you're getting the lengthened part in. And look, there's been a lot of, this is anecdotal, but a lot of bodybuilders, go look at pumping iron with Lou Ferrigno. He's doing his shoulder presses, but this was a shoulder press. So he wasn't doing the full range, he was just doing, and there's been other bodybuilders, Jay Cutler, I've seen some videos of him, where again, he's doing a lot of these lengthened partials rather than full. Now that anecdotal evidence is a weak form of evidence, but again, that is somewhat supported by the evidence that we have.
Yeah. So if somebody was maybe seeing all this information on social media and thinking about incorporating something into their routine, how would you recommend some exercises that would be an easy way to transition into trying some of these long range of motion partials? Would it be towards the end of the set? Like you said, you can't complete the full overhead press and you do a few at the bottom. Would it just be doing a set there? Maybe some exercises you recommend to try?
So I think that the jury is still out. Like we don't have, if you're asking, so I can speculate just from my own personal that I've used and personal preference. We don't have good research on any of that. I do think, and what I've used it on mostly in the past is as a finishing type of move. So basically a set extender. So let's say you're doing a fly or a pec deck, where you're using full range of motion, and then as you're not able, let's say going to failure, kind of like instead of a drop set, you just do some lengthened partials. And we actually have a recent study that was published, not my group, but there was a recent study that was published that did show greater growth with extended set. There's a preprint out of it now. So an extended set partial seemed to show better hypertrophy. So that would be my general, or at least the way I've used it, and I think the smart way that it probably might best be used. But yeah, you can also experiment. Nothing is either. It's always either. It doesn't have to be either or. It's always can be effective. Where you might decide to do a full set of a partial, lengthened partial, and mix that in with full range. I do think that full range in general should be your default at this point, at least on most exercises. And by the way, I'm not even willing to dismiss that there may be some benefits to short position movements, like a hip thrust for the glutes. I mean, there was a recent study that came out, my good colleague Brett Contreras,
the glute guy.
Daniel, the glute guy, and Daniel Plotkin, my former student, actually led that study. And it showed no difference between between a squat, a full range of motion squat, and a hip thrust. But the hip thrust, there wasn't a condition where they looked at combining the hip thrust with the squat to see if they may have synergistic. So it may be that there's a synergistic aspect of lengthened and shortened movements. And again, I think this is, like I said, an area that's still ripe for more research.
Yeah, I love that. Really good answer. So as far as transitioning to our next topic here, I'd love to talk a little bit about volume. So for basically the last 7 years, and I know you've led a bunch of different studies on the high-end range, super low and efficient range of exercise. I used to be a full body, single set to failure guy. I think the research still supports that this is a really great time efficient strategy, especially if you already have a base to maintain. But based on the research you've done, I know you're kind of the king of this area. You're literally the hypertrophy guy, right? Brett can be the glute guy, he can be the hypertrophy guy. What is the ideal volume if somebody wants to maximize muscle? Would you still say it's at 10 to 20 sets per muscle per week?
So first of all, there's no such thing. The ideal volume is always specific to the individual. Right? The ideal, pretty much anything, but certainly volume, there's a very high level of variability in these types of studies when you actually look at the individual responses. So it's to say that everyone has the same needs. I mean, this is a topic I think that we need a full discussion to really delve into the nuances. But one thing you have to realize is that the research that we have on this topic is not on all the muscle. We don't have research that has looked at doing a certain amount of volume for every muscle group. So the triceps get 20 sets. So everything is extrapolated from a small number of muscle groups that are given a certain amount of volume. And we've tried to extrapolate that out and taken our own practical experience into account. I think in general, a 10 to 20 per week per muscle set is probably a decent range. I think that from optimizing muscle growth, some people I think respond quite well to somewhat lower volumes. I also don't think this is something that should be looked at in that context, because if you look at volume, again, first of all, most of the studies are relatively short term that we have on this 8, 10, 12 weeks. If you did that for a year at very high volumes, look, Arnold Schwarzenegger did. Virtually all the bodybuilders in the 70s were doing 3-hour workouts a day, 6 days a week. And now they were on gear, and you can make certain assumptions there. But what I would say is that there's certainly the potential with very high volumes over time for overtraining. We've never seen that in research. But again, the studies are relatively short, so they might not account for that. And I think there is at least a logical basis to periodizing volume so that you do shorter, let's say, a transition from a lower volume block to a moderate volume block to a higher volume block, and what that is. I mean, could it be 10 sets to 15 sets to 20 sets over a 3-month period, let's say per month? There's no exact recipe for that. And that, again, will be specific to the individual, recovery needs. I think the training status of people, how heavy they're lifting, all these things need to be taken into account. And I also would say that you're looking at the total amount of volume for all the muscles, like how many sets total are you doing in a given week? You don't necessarily have to do equal amounts of volume for every body part. First of all, when you're talking like the arms, they're getting a lot of ancillary work. You need to do the exact same volume for biceps as you're doing for your back when the back is getting substantial biceps work. I would say certainly not. That volume would count towards that. But I would also say that you probably are best off apportioning the total volume to your lagging muscle groups so that the lagging muscle groups get somewhat higher volumes and your more well-developed muscle groups would get less volume. So you're staying within a certain number of sets per week for all the your total exercise budget, if you will.
Yeah, I love
and
that.
Finally, I'm sorry. And finally, I was going to say to your first point. So we just finished carrying out a study. It's now in review on single set training, and you can get, as you kind of mentioned, very good results. So if you're talking about optimization, yeah, there's a good evidence. There's a dose response relationship to volume and hypertrophy, but the majority of gains can be achieved through very minimalistic type of training approaches. And our single set research study showed that. These were trained subjects and they got quite good volume. By the way, all of them were doing multi-set routines before, so they substantially reduced their volume and still made gains.
Yeah. So going a little deeper on that, because I think it's easy to talk about the optimal volume when you have 3 hours a day, right? You're 20 years old, you don't have any responsibilities. I think that most people are really interested in is the sufficient stimulus necessary to get to as close to optimal as possible. So from that efficiency standpoint of this research study you're talking about, what would be some recommendations for there if you don't have, 3 hours? Maybe you've got 30, 45 minutes, 2 to 3 days per week.
Yeah, so what you're referring to would be a minimum effective dose, what we call an MED. I would say that, again, these are just estimates. So I'm always somewhat hesitant because people take these as like, that's the key. I need to do this, or 10 to 20, something magical, 10 sets, 9 sets, no good. It has to be minimum 10 sets. It doesn't work like that. But I would say probably somewhere in a 4 to 6 sets per muscle per week range. That's what we did in the in our single set study. It was a 2-day per week training program, total body routine. Literally took 30 minutes. So you're talking 60 total minutes of training per week, and they got good results. These were subjects with 3.5 plus years of average training experience. So
yeah, I think that's awesome. And that's probably more practical for most people. So going into the efficiency piece a little bit deeper, talk to me about interset rest. Because again, when we talk about like the repetition continuum, what I always heard was, if you want to train for strength, you got to have extended periods of rest. If you're trying to get more of a hypertrophy benefit, keeping it 30 to 60 seconds in between. What does the most recent research kind of say of maximizing hypertrophy, maybe maximizing strength, and what rest periods might actually be adequate for that?
Yeah, so we recently published a meta-analysis, which is a pooled data approach to the total body of literature, and we did that for hypertrophy on rest intervals. And it's a myth that you need short rest intervals for hypertrophy. That was, in short, based on what was called the hormone hypothesis, talking about jacking up the hormone levels post-exercise, which has generally been shown not to have much, if any, real effect on muscle development, or certainly minimal effect. And actually, it seems to show there's a detriment, our paper. You can still use short rest intervals and get good results, but it did blunt hypertrophy to some extent when you're going a minute or less. So when we got to around 90 seconds, there did not seem to be much difference in hypertrophy between 90 seconds versus 2 minutes versus 3 minutes and beyond. I will say that with the caveat, there isn't a lot of, this is another area that we need more studies on. So I think the strength of evidence is still somewhat weak to moderate. And I'd also say that there's nuance to it. It probably will depend on the type of exercise. We weren't able to subanalyze these effects, but like a squat, I would just think logically needs somewhat more rest than a lateral raise would in terms of your ability to recover interset. Now that's for hypertrophy. We did not do the evidence on strength is somewhat less clear from an overall look at the literature. And I'm not aware of any metas that have been done, at least recently, on that. But I think the evidence still seems to show that somewhat longer rest is beneficial. Again, it would depend upon how close you are to failure. Now, there is some evidence, by the way, that from a failure standpoint, strength does not need to be taken relatively close to failure. So you probably could get away with shorter rest if you're going further away from failure. But if you're going to be training closer to failure, so there are nuances to these topics. I think how heavy your training is going to have an influence on that as well.
Yeah, no, that's the perfect answer and super nuanced. I wouldn't expect anything less. But no, I think that's a great general recommendation for somebody that's looking to maximize time too. The only, I guess, caveat or addition I would have is I think this was maybe it was Daniel Plotkin or it was Ryan Burke that did your superset study at Lehman that was kind of looking at how to maximize that time, right? So if you are strapped for time, doing something like a superset, maybe taking that 90 seconds rest in between a push and a pull, and then minimizing the time in between can be a great opportunity to maximize time. You touched on failure there.
That was Ryan, and I do want to say that was Ryan, and that's absolutely true. So yeah, you can make your workouts more efficient by we used a paired superset, which was agonist antagonist. Now again, the limitation of that, we just looked at it was a somewhat minimalistic routine. So if you're going to do that for all the muscles of your body or for multiple sets over multiple muscle groups, you may deal with some fatigue issues from the superset itself. So that needs to be taken into account as well.
Yeah, that's great. And again, I'm thinking from like a minimum approach, right? So if somebody's only got 30 minutes to do something, I think that would be a great approach. You talked about failure. We've touched on RIR a couple times here. I used to be a failure zealot, right? Like if you didn't fail, you might as well not even do the step, right? It's a total waste. So how have your thoughts on failure training maybe adapted over the years? Obviously, there's a lot of nuance in this one, right? It depends on the volume, it depends on the time. But what does the research say comparing RIR and momentary failure, and maybe how close those two interplay?
Yeah, so I'm just like you. I came from the old school bodybuilding approach that you either go all out or go home, and that not only did every set need to be taken to failure, but you wanted to use drop sets and forced reps and any type of advanced training technique to go, quote unquote, beyond failure if you can, to really tax your body. And yeah, this is an area that my opinion on has changed quite drastically as well, that the body of literature seems to suggest, and this is particularly specific to multi-joint, multi-set routines where you're doing more than one set per exercise, that training to failure or staying within, let's say, a 2 RIR or so does not make much, if any, difference to going to failure, that you can train somewhat away from failure and still see very similar gains to going to failure. And for strength, it's even less. That's for hypertrophy. For strength, there's evidence that you can be 4 or 5 RIR and still see similar strength gains. Our study on the, was kind of interesting bringing this up, our study on the single set routines was an RIR versus failure study. And that was really the genesis of it, was to see, because the claim always, the Arthur Jones claim was always that you need to train all out failure and beyond. One set is all you need, but you have to take it to all out failure. And the question was, is that really true? Since we're seeing this over and over in the multi-set routines, does that actually carry over to single set routines. And the evidence did show that it was more relevant to single set routines, that there did seem, again, the group that did not train to failure, that was at a 2 RIR, still saw very good gains. But there was a slightly better result effect for the, to failure, at least in some of the muscles. It didn't also transpose to all the muscles across that we looked at. I'm not sure if that was just chance or it's difficult to know. Again, this was one study, and one study always begets other studies, and you need to replicate to have strong evidence. But I would say that you probably need to train somewhat closer, if not to failure, when you're doing single set routines, if you want to optimize results. But you still can get good gains even with single set routines without doing so.
So that was the recent study you mentioned, the single set study. You had people going to failure versus 2 RIR. Got it. Yeah, that's
and by the
super
way, strength exactly the same.
Yeah. And I think that's super interesting too for people who are starting out and maybe who don't understand or have the capability to get to failure. Like work as hard as you have the capacity to, and you still might not be a failure, but you might be a 2 RIR. Or you might start out at a 4 and then you work your way up to a 2, right? And then eventually you understand what real failure looks like. But I think that's a great reminder too, that if you're not working with someone, if you're just starting something on your own for the first time, working with a partner, working with a qualified coach that can actually show you what this looks like can be just a huge advantage. Because I'm sure you would agree that if you've never trained to failure before, you probably can't train to 2 RIR.
So I was just going to add that it doesn't discount the need that you have to at least train to failure, certainly at some point early in your career, to understand what that quote unquote feels like. By the way, one of the other aspects of that study was that we gauged the subject's ability to gauge RIR. How good were they at estimating their proximity to failure? And it was actually quite good once we showed them what quote unquote what the RIR was, how to estimate the RIR. We did a brief introductory session. They were within 2 reps, and most of them were in less than that, were within a rep of their RIR. Now, these are people that are trained to failure, and they got better at it, by the way, over the course of the study. So as they trained through these studies, they actually were able to better gauge their failure. And interestingly, the ones who trained to failure had somewhat better outcomes at the end in improving their ability to train to failure. To gauge RIR from training to failure.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, the more you do it, you'd think the better you would get at being able to understand where you are on that spectrum. So the last topic I had today for you, Dr. Schoenfeld, is on cheat reps and form, right? So when I first started, it was always, again, Arthur Jonesian, very strict, like have to get to volitional fatigue. And if you're not doing something where you're doing drop sets or assisted reps, things like that, as soon as you reach that point, you weren't doing anything else to cheat. Now, Arthur obviously talked a little bit about some cheat reps and stuff, but there's been some recent research. I know Dr. Pack led a study that was looking at, I think it was a meta maybe, that was looking at, how strict do you have to be on form? What are your current and former thoughts on things like cheat reps and strict form adherence and how it might affect your strength and hypertrophy outcomes?
Yes, a great topic and very apropos, because one of my students, Francesca Augustin, just finished a study looking at that exact topic. So one group, or it was actually within subject design. So one arm did cheat reps, basically using momentum on all, getting to limitations, but all reps were done with external momentum. And the other arm did very strict form. It was biceps, so bicep curls and tricep press downs. And at the end of the 8-week study period, no difference. They both got very similar hypertrophy. A couple of caveats. Number one, these were untrained subjects, because you're not going to get trained subjects to do just bicep curls and tricep press downs for a given period of time for 2 months plus. But I would say this, that first of all, these were single joint exercises. If you're using that on squats or chest press, where you're starting to get other muscle groups more involved that are taking over, could there be negative effects? I don't know. I also would say that it wasn't long enough and there wasn't enough subjects to really determine whether there may be injuries. I think an 8-week study would be generally insufficient anyway, even if you had 1,000 subjects. To look at injury rate, you're just not going to be able, I don't think, you're going to see that many injuries within that period of time. But I think over a training career, that can start to wane on you and start to affect the joints. So I think it is important there to consider the effects on your joint health. And particularly then, like I said, these were single joint movements. If you're doing that on squats or deadlifts, bench press, seated rows, bent rows, I think you might have more problems there. But I do think the take home that I would have is that probably form is a little less important than I had thought, and I think a lot of people may have thought that you don't need to be a form Nazi, if you will, or technique Nazi. But, you probably are still going to get very similar, if not the same gains with that. And I also would say, like I said, the limitation here is that we did this on all reps, where cheat reps I think may have additional value is at the end of the set. Really, like you can do forced reps if you have a spotter and certain other instances, but sometimes you don't, and that it's kind of a way to get forced reps without a spotter. See the pictures of Arnold doing his cheat reps.
Yeah. Made like a cheat rep lengthened partial study. Yeah, with that in mind too, one of the things I've seen, I think it was the Dr. Tack's paper, where they were talking about some things like knee values, right? So particularly squats. What are your thoughts on, and you may not have particular research to back this up, but just your intuition. I think I have a general idea of where your head would be, right? Like over the course of a training career. Have we maybe been too much of form Nazis as coaches and not really adjusting for people's physical capabilities and their different biomechanics and things like that? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so look, there's basic biomechanical principles that you need to follow if you want to target certain muscles or get stronger in certain movement patterns. Very important that you follow proper biomechanical principles. It's also important to understand that people have different body types and they're not going to be able to do exercises. There's no universal best form for everyone that you need to take into account. Things like you're talking about. Injury history can also somewhat dictate that. But body habitus is going to be a big factor there. Flexibility will be a factor. And to say that here is perfect form, it could be perfect form for that particular individual, but a different individual may need to alter their form to account for their own body habits.
Yeah, I think that's great. And for any coaches who are listening too, in the beginning of your training career, and I know you can relate to this because you trained for a long time, is you expect everybody to be like a pro athlete. And the reality is that most people are not, physiologically wired or neurologically wired to go ass to grass on every set of squats, right? So being able to adjust, keep the biomechanics correct, but also acquiesce to whatever that person is physically capable of, I think is a fantastic quality to have as a trainer. So I'd love to kind of recap this because I'm sensitive to your time. So when it comes to partials, maybe incorporating some, maybe don't go full Milo Wolf and do every rep of every set, lengthen partial position, but it could be a great way to, add in a little bit of additional volume at the end of your set. When it comes to volume, it really depends on what kind of time you have, what you're willing to commit to, and what your body actually responds to. So doing some experimentation there. With interset rest, probably keeping it at least over a minute, maybe up to 3, depending on the type of exercise you're doing and how winded you are. Again, very individual variation there. Failure versus RIR. If you don't know what failure is, you should probably just train to try to get to failure instead of trying to figure out what your RIR is. If you're more experienced and you're doing multi-set training, could be a good way to make sure that you're not overtaxing yourself, especially if you're increasing your volume significantly. And then when it comes to cheat reps, don't maybe do every single rep swinging, right? But if you're trying to get a little more out of the set, maybe putting a little body English on it at the end isn't the worst thing in the world.
Couldn't have said it better.
That's great. So just to kind of wrap up here with you as well, Dr. Schoenfeld. Obviously, thank you so much for joining me today. I'd love for anyone who's interested. I've been teasing this. I talked to Max about it recently. I know he's waiting for the PhD program. Any updates on that at Lehman and when that might be coming? If students are interested in doing the master's program or maybe even getting their PhD in the future?
Yeah, so our master's program has been up and running for 6 years now. We have a terrific, not only program, but body of students, and basically they're all encouraged to be involved in the research that we're talking about. Many of them, as you know, my former students are and have been. And I'm pleased to say that our PhD program will officially start in September of this year, 2025. So I am accepting a limited number of students to mentor. First come, first serve for my master students, but I will be taking some outside students as well. So yeah.
Is that going to be all in person as well at Lehman?
Yeah, it's not, they would need to be on campus.
Gotcha. That's awesome.
They'd be carrying out research in our lab.
In the lab.
It would be a mentoring, yeah.
Awesome. That's super cool for anybody who's interested. Or obviously, I'm looking forward to being able to say Dr. Coleman.
He will be, I'm sure.
Yeah, for sure. I'm sure he's first on the list. I don't doubt it. Well, Brad, if anybody's interested in learning a little more about you, obviously they can just type your name into ResearchGate, just scroll for hours. If they wanted to maybe contact you, get in touch, Twitter, X, Instagram, what's a good way to reach you?
Just Google me. I'm on Twitter, Instagram. I have a website. That'll all come up for you. You'll get more than you want. Just Google me.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for taking the time today, Dr. Schoenfeld. Thank you guys for listening. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. And we'll be back soon for another episode of Exercise is Bullshit.